Dear listener, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe and click like, and maybe write a little in the comment system. Thank you. And if you have made yourself comfortable with candlelight and cocoa in a cup and a warm wool blanket over your feet, then I will start reading these, well, some people say, this horrible store for you. Chapter 1. The Whispering Pines. The silence of the forest grew oppressive as darkness descended. The snowflakes, delicate and shimmering, turned heavier, their weight accumulating on the uneven ground and muffling their footsteps. Alexander tightened his scarf against the biting cold, his fingers numb inside his gloves. "We should find shelter," he said, glancing at Lily, who had stopped humming. Her cheeks were flushed, and her breath came in quick puffs. "We can't stop now," she replied, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "It's not that far." Alexander grabbed her arm gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. "We don't even know if we're going the right way." She pulled away, her face a mixture of defiance and fear. "We can't go back empty-handed. Do you know what they'll say about us?" He hesitated. Lily had always been the bold one, unafraid of judgment, but now she seemed vulnerable, desperate to prove something. Alexander wondered if her confidence had been a facade all along. "I don't care what they say," he finally said. "We'll freeze to death out here if we don't find shelter." They pressed on, their steps slower, more deliberate. The forest seemed alive, its branches creaking under the weight of snow. Alexander felt a growing unease, a sense that they were being watched. He dismissed it as exhaustion, but the hairs on the back of his neck refused to settle. "Do you hear that?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. He stopped and listened. At first there was nothing but the sound of the snow falling around them. But then it came, a faint rustling, like dry leaves brushing together. It was too rhythmic to be the wind. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though he didn't believe it. "An animal wouldn't follow us," Lily replied, clutching his arm. The rustling stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. They exchanged a glance, their earlier arguments forgotten in the face of a growing dread. "We need to keep moving," Alexander said, his voice firm. "We'll find a cabin or a cave, anything." The snowstorm intensified, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Visibility dwindled to mere feet, and the cold seeped into their bones despite their layers of clothing. Alexander led the way, his eyes scanning for anything that resembled shelter. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but he forced himself to focus. Lily stumbled behind him, her usual grace replaced by exhaustion. I don't think I can go on," she said, her voice trembling. "You can," Alexander replied, his tone sharper than he intended. "We have to." He reached back to steady her, but her hand slipped from his grasp. She fell to her knees, her face pale and her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Lily!" He knelt beside her, shaking her shoulders. "You can't stop here. You'll freeze." Her eyes fluttered open, filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I thought we'd make it." "Don't talk like that," he said, his voice breaking. "You're not giving up, not now." They found a hollow beneath a cluster of trees, the ground shielded from the worst of the snow. It wasn't much, but it was something. Alexander piled branches around them, creating a makeshift windbreak, and wrapped his scarf around Lily's neck to keep her warm. "I'll keep watch," he said, though his own body screamed for rest. "You just need to stay awake. Talk to me." She nodded weakly, her lips turning blue. "Do you remember the summer we sneaked out to the lake?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Of course," he said, forcing a smile. "You nearly drowned trying to catch that stupid fish." She laughed faintly. "I just wanted to impress you." "You don't have to impress me," he said, his throat tightening. "You never did." As the night dragged on, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Alexander fought to keep his eyes open, his mind playing tricks on him. The rustling sound returned, louder this time, closer. He clutched a broken branch like a weapon, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he shouted into the darkness, but only the wind answered. Lily stirred beside him, her breath shallow. "Alex, there's someone out there." He shook his head, refusing to believe it. "It's just the wind." But deep down, he knew she was right. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The first light of dawn was barely visible through the storm when Lily stopped responding. Her body was still, and her face was peaceful despite the cold that had claimed her. Alexander shook her, his voice rising in panic. "Lily, wake up, please." Tears froze on his cheeks as he clutched her lifeless form. He screamed into the storm, a primal sound of grief and rage that echoed through the forest. And then, as if in response, the rustling grew louder. Footsteps crunched in the snow, deliberate and unhurried. Alexander turned, his eyes wild, but saw nothing. "You can't have her," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't take her from me." The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the forest was silent again. But Alexander felt the presence, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into his very soul. He carried Lily's body through the storm, refusing to leave her behind. His mind spiraled into chaos, memories of their time together blending with hallucinations. He heard her voice, felt her touch, but when he turned, there was nothing. "You promised," the voice whispered. "You said we'd make it." "I'm sorry," he sobbed. I tried so hard." The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and the rustling became a cacophony of whispers. "Why did you let me die?" the voice asked, and this time it was unmistakably Lily's. The snowstorm had passed, leaving a frozen silence in its wake, when the search party from the boarding school found Alexander hours later. He was slumped against a tree, barely alive. His lips were cracked and blue, his skin frostbitten. The most haunting of all were his eyes, wide and hollow, as if something had reached into his mind and stolen a part of him. "Over here," one of the men called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. They rushed to Alexander's side, wrapping him in blankets and lifting him onto a sled. A few yards away they found Lily, her body rigid and pale, cradled in Alexander's arms. The search party spoke little as they made their way back to the school. There was no need for words. The sight of the two students, one barely clinging to life and the other lost forever, spoke volumes. But unease rippled through them like an undercurrent. Something about the scene felt wrong, as if the forest itself had conspired against the young pair. Back at the school, Alexander awoke in the infirmary, the world swimming before his eyes. Pain throbbed through his limbs, but it was nothing compared to the torment in his mind. Images of the storm, of Lily's lifeless face, and of the shadows that had followed them played in an endless loop. "Alexander." The voice of Headmaster Crane was sharp, cutting through the haze. The headmaster stood at the foot of the bed, his tall frame rigid, his expression unreadable. Where's Lily?" Alexander croaked, his throat dry and raw. Headmaster Crane hesitated, his eyes flickering with something close to pity. "She didn't make it." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He turned his face to the wall, unable to meet the headmaster's gaze. "What happened out there?" Crane pressed. "The storm wasn't supposed to be that severe. Did you stray from the path? Alexander shook his head weakly. The path disappeared. The storm. It wasn't natural. What do you mean? Crane's tone sharpened. What are you saying? There was something out there, Alexander whispered, his voice trembling. Something watching us. A seed of suspicion rumors spread quickly through the school. The students whispered about the tragedy, each retelling more embellished than the last. Some claimed Alexander had gotten lost on purpose, jealous of Lily's popularity. Others said the forest was cursed, that it claimed those who dared to venture too deep. But Alexander knew the truth, or at least he thought he did. The storm, the rustling, the shadows. It hadn't been a random act of nature. Someone or something had wanted them to perish. A note and a warning. A week later, as Alexander struggled to regain his strength, he found an envelope slipped beneath his door. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged, as if written in haste. Inside was a single sentence. She was never meant to return. Alexander's heart raced as he reread the note, his mind spinning. Who had written it, and what did it mean? His thoughts turned to Lily, to her insistence on continuing, despite the worsening weather. Had she known something he didn't? He began to piece together fragments of conversations they'd had in the weeks leading up to the trip. Lily had been secretive, mentioning cryptic messages she'd received and expressing unease about the headmaster. At the time, Alexander had dismissed it as her imagination running wild. Now, he wasn't so sure. Determined to find answers, Alexander began observing the staff and students, his suspicion growing with each passing day. He noticed the way certain teachers avoided his gaze, the hurried whispers that stopped when he entered a room. The headmaster, usually composed, seemed on edge, his tone curt, and his presence less commanding. One evening, Alexander overheard a heated conversation between Headmaster Crane and another teacher, Miss Caro. Their voices were muffled through the thick oak door, but he caught fragments that sent chills down his spine. Unfortunate accident, but we had no choice. Not safe anymore, especially after the letters. Alexander's heart pounded. Letters, the very ones he and Lily had been tasked with delivering. What could have been so important in those envelopes that someone might orchestrate their deaths to ensure they never reached their destination? Confronting the shadows. Fueled by desperation and grief, Alexander decided to act. Late one night, he slipped into the headmaster's office, his footsteps silent on the worn wooden floors. The room smelled of ink and old paper, the faint glow of moonlight casting long shadows. He rifled through drawers and cabinets, his fingers trembling. At last, he found a bundle of letters, their seals broken. The contents were cryptic, filled with references to debts, threats, and something called the Pact. "What are you doing here?" a voice growled. Alexander spun around to see Headmaster Crane standing in the doorway, his expression dark. In his hand was a cane, its polished surface glinting in the dim light. "Explain yourself," Crane demanded, stepping closer. "You knew," Alexander said, his voice shaking with fury. "You knew the storm was coming. You knew we wouldn't make it." Crane's face twisted, a mixture of anger and something else. Fear. "You don't understand what you're talking about. Put those letters down." "They killed her," Alexander shouted. "You killed her!" The headmaster's expression hardened. "You have no idea what's at stake. Some sacrifices are necessary." The consequences. Before Alexander could react, Crane struck him with the cane, sending him sprawling. The letters scattered across the floor. Pain exploded through his skull as the world blurred. Crane loomed over him, his voice cold and unyielding. "You've already lost enough," he said. "Don't make me take more." When Alexander woke, he was back in the infirmary, the letters gone, and the memory of Crane's words burning in his mind. No one believed his story, dismissing it as the ramblings of a boy broken by grief. But Alexander knew the truth. Lily's death had been no accident, and he would stop at nothing to uncover the full extent of the betrayal, even if it meant losing himself in the process. The snow outside the boarding school had melted into patches of ice, but the chill lingered in the air, as if the storm that claimed Lily had left something behind. Inside the ancient stone walls of the school, whispers followed Alexander like a shadow. Students glanced his way in the halls, their hushed voices filled with theories, pity, and fear. "Do you think he did it?" one would murmur. "I heard he lost his mind out there," another would reply. But Alexander had no time for their speculation. His focus was singular: uncover the truth about Lily's death and the web of deceit that surrounded the school. The cryptic note, "She was never meant to return," had planted a seed of suspicion that grew with each passing day. The watchful eyes. Alexander began to notice the subtle changes in his surroundings. Teachers who once barely acknowledged his existence now seemed to watch him closely, their gazes lingering a moment too long. Conversations would cease when he entered a room, replaced by strained silence. Even his closest peers avoided him, their discomfort palpable. "I don't care what they think," Alexander muttered to himself, clutching the small leather journal where he documented every clue, every suspicion. "I just need answers." The journal had become his lifeline, filled with hastily scrawled notes about the letters, Crane's cryptic remarks, and the strange symbols he'd begun to notice carved into the woodwork and etched into the school's old stones. At first he thought they were just ornamental, relics of the school's history, but now they felt deliberate, purposeful, like warnings, an unexpected ally. One evening, as Alexander sat alone in the library, poring over ancient texts in search of meaning behind the symbols, a soft voice broke the silence. "You're not imagining it, you know." He looked up sharply to see Claire, a quiet and studious girl from his year. Her dark hair framed her pale face, and her eyes held a mixture of fear and determination. "What do you mean?" Alexander asked cautiously. Claire slid into the seat across from him, glancing around to ensure no one else was near. "The symbols, the whispers, the way the teachers are acting, I've noticed it too." Alexander leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "You believe me?" She nodded, lowering her voice. "My older brother went here. He told me things before he disappeared." "Disappeared?" Alexander echoed, his stomach tightening. Claire hesitated as if deciding how much to reveal. "He left on a trip, like you and Lily, only he never came back. The school said he ran away, but I know that's not true." Her words sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. He opened his journal, showing her the sketch he'd made of the symbols. "Have you seen these before?" Claire's face paled. "Yes. They're part of something old, a pact, I think. My brother mentioned it, but I didn't understand." Unearthing the past together, Alexander and Claire began their investigation in earnest. Late at night, when the rest of the school was asleep, they scoured the library's restricted archives. Dusty tomes and faded scrolls revealed fragments of a disturbing history. The boarding school, it seemed, had been founded on land with a dark reputation. Centuries ago, the townspeople whispered of rituals conducted in the nearby woods, offerings made to ensure prosperity and safety. The symbols Alexander had seen were part of those rituals, binding the land's protectors to the school and its inhabitants. "What protectors?" Claire whispered, her finger tracing the jagged lines of a faded drawing. Alexander stared at the page, the image of shadowy, humanoid figures etched into the parchment. I don't think they're protectors anymore. Their research led them back to the letters, specifically the ones Alexander and Lily had been tasked with delivering. Claire used her connections with the staff to gain access to the headmaster's office, and together they sifted through documents late into the night. The truth was worse than they could have imagined. The letters had been warnings sent to prominent figures in the neighboring town. They spoke of the school's dwindling protection and hinted at a coming reckoning if the pact was not maintained. They sent us knowing the storm would come, Alexander said, his voice trembling with rage. We were their offering. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. But why Lily? Why not both of you? Alexander shook his head, the realization dawning like a thunderclap. Because she was loved. She mattered to people. They knew her death would seal the pact more strongly. The knowledge ate away at Alexander's sanity. The betrayal of the school, the loss of Lily, the sinister forces at play. It was too much. He began to see her everywhere, in the frost on the windows, in the flicker of candlelight, in the corner of his vision where shadows stretched unnaturally long. You promised, her voice echoed in his mind, a mix of accusation and sorrow. You said we'd make it. I'm trying, Alexander shouted one night, his voice echoing through the empty dormitory. I'm trying to make it right. But the haunting only grew stronger. Claire too began to notice the strange occurrences, the whispers that followed them, the doors that creaked open on their own, the cold spots that lingered in rooms long after they'd left. It's her, Claire said one night, her voice trembling. She's trying to tell us something. No, Alexander replied, his face pale and drawn. She's angry, and I don't blame her. The consequences. Their discovery didn't go unnoticed. Headmaster Crane confronted Alexander and Claire in the library, his face a mask of cold fury. You've gone too far, he said, his voice low and menacing. You don't understand what you're meddling with. Alexander stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. You let her die. You sent us out there to save yourselves. Crane's expression didn't waver. The pact must be upheld. Without it, the school falls, the land dies. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary. Not like this, Claire said, her voice shaking. You're monsters. Crane's gaze hardened. You're children. You don't know the weight of responsibility. You've sealed your fate. The shadows in the room seem to stretch closer as Alexander reads the words, and for the first time he feels true fear, not for himself but for Claire and the vengeance that he knows is coming. The following days were an escalating spiral of fear, confusion, and desperation. Alexander and Claire were haunted not only by the truths they had uncovered, but by the creeping realization that the pact, whatever dark agreement bound the school to its safety, was unraveling. The land around the school seemed to grow restless, as though the earth itself rejected their defiance. The shadows in Alexander's room became alive. At first, they moved in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, a flicker where no light had caused it, the sensation of being watched from the corners. Then came the whispers, faint and indistinct, but unmistakable. You can't save her, the voices hissed. You failed her. Alexander sat up in his bed, drenched in sweat, clutching his journal to his chest like a talisman. Leave me alone, he whispered, his voice trembling. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable cacophony. Lily's voice was among them now, calling out to him with sorrowful anger. You promised, Alex. Claire found him the next morning in the library, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. You look like hell, she said, though her own face was pale and dark circles shadowed her eyes. They won't stop, Alexander said, his voice hoarse. The whispers, the shadows. Lily. Claire hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll figure this out, together. But as they delved deeper into the school's archives, their resolve began to waver. They found records of previous students who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, always during storms, always near the woods. The most chilling discovery was an account from decades ago, written by a former headmaster. The pact is weakening. The spirits grow restless. An offering must be made to restore balance, or the school will perish. They've been doing this for years, Claire whispered, her voice trembling, sacrificing students to keep their precious school safe. Alexander slammed the book shut, his jaw clenched. No more. We end this. Their plan was reckless but necessary. That night they would confront Headmaster Crane and expose the truth to the rest of the school. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the storm began to return, this time more violent than before. The wind howled through the ancient stone corridors, rattling windows and extinguishing lamps. Students huddled in their dormitories, their frightened whispers echoing down the halls. Alexander and Claire waited in the shadows near the headmaster's office, their breath visible in the icy air. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of fear and determination. What if this doesn't work? Claire asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. It has to, Alexander replied, though his heart pounded with doubt. If we do nothing, more people will die. When Crane finally appeared, he was flanked by 2 teachers, their faces pale and grim. The headmaster's eyes narrowed as he spotted Alexander and Claire. You should have stayed out of this, Crane said, his voice cold and steady. You've brought this upon yourselves. No, Alexander shot back, stepping forward. You brought this on all of us. You've been sacrificing students for years to protect this place. The headmaster's expression darkened. You don't understand the stakes. Without the pact, the school will crumble. The land will turn barren. Everyone here will suffer. Claire's voice trembled with rage. So you murder children to save your precious school. You're a monster. Crane took a step closer, his gaze piercing. It's not murder, it's balance. The spirits demand it, and without them, we are nothing. You're wrong, Alexander said, his voice breaking. We can break the cycle. Crane's lips curled into a grim smile. You think you're the first to try? The spirits don't forgive. They don't forget. Before Alexander or Claire could respond, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. The temperature dropped, frost creeping across the walls and floor. The storm outside grew deafening, the wind howling like a living thing. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing, their voices echoing through the room. Crane and the teachers looked around in fear, their bravado crumbling. You've angered them, Crane whispered, his face pale. You've doomed us all. The shadows coalesced into forms, twisting inhuman shapes with glowing eyes that radiated malice. One of the teachers screamed as a shadow enveloped him, his body convulsing before collapsing lifelessly to the floor. Run! Claire shouted, grabbing Alexander's arm. They fled through the labyrinthine halls of the school, the shadows chasing them with unnatural speed. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with cold and despair. Students screamed as the storm shattered windows, the wind tearing through the building like a vengeful force. Alexander clutched Claire's hand, pulling her through the chaos. We have to get to the chapel, he shouted over the roar of the storm. It's the only place they might not follow. The chapel? Claire gasped. Why? I don't know, he admitted, but it's our only chance. They burst into the chapel, slamming the heavy wooden doors behind them. The room was eerily silent, the storm muted as if held at bay by the sacred space. Candles flickered weakly on the altar, casting long shadows. Crane was already there, his face twisted in despair. "You can't stop them," he said, his voice trembling. "The spirits demand blood." "No," Alexander shouted. "There has to be another way." But the shadows seeped under the doors, pooling like black water before rising into monstrous forms. Lily's voice rang out, clear and haunting. "You promised, Al." Alexander fell to his knees, his mind breaking under the weight of guilt and grief. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The shadows surged forward, but Claire stepped in front of Alexander, her face defiant. "Take me instead," she said, her voice steady. "If it's blood you want, take mine." "No," Alexander cried, reaching for her, but it was too late. The shadows enveloped Claire, her scream piercing the air before fading into silence. The storm outside ceased instantly, the shadows retreating like smoke in the wind. The chapel was quiet once more, but the price had been paid. When the morning light broke, Alexander was found alone in the chapel, his mind shattered. He muttered incoherently about shadows, spirits, and sacrifices. His once bright eyes now dull and lifeless. The school was abandoned soon after, its halls left to the echoes of the past. Locals avoided the area, calling it cursed. But some nights, travelers swore they saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, his hollow eyes watching, waiting. The shadows consumed the chapel, their tendrils snaking across the stone floor as Alexander and Claire stood back to back, clutching each other for strength. The spirits seemed unstoppable, their whispers growing louder, filling the air with accusations and rage. "Lily, is that you?" Alexander asked, his voice trembling as one shadow loomed closer, its shape flickering into something vaguely human. The shadow paused, and for a moment, Alexander thought he saw her face, but then it twisted into something grotesque, its teeth gleaming, its eyes hollow and endless. The spirits were not Lily. They were older, darker forces bound by the pact. They wanted more than blood. They wanted souls. "You can't have us," Claire screamed, swinging a heavy candlestick at the shadows. It passed through them harmlessly, and the spirits surged forward. The chapel doors burst open, revealing Headmaster Crane, his face pale with fear. "You've doomed us all," he shouted, his voice echoing through the storm. "The pact cannot be broken." The shadows turned their attention to Crane, who screamed as they enveloped him, tearing at his flesh. His cries faded into gurgles, and his body collapsed into ash. But the spirits were still hungry. Realizing there was no escape, Alexander made a choice. "Take me," he said, his voice shaking. "Leave her alone." The spirits hesitated, as if considering his offer. Claire grabbed his arm. "No, don't do this." "I have to," Alexander replied, his eyes filled with both terror and resolve. "It's the only way." The shadows surged toward him, wrapping around his body like chains. He screamed as they tore into him, his form dissolving into the darkness. The storm outside ceased, the whispers fading into silence. Claire stood alone in the chapel, tears streaming down her face. Alexander was gone, his sacrifice sealing the pact once more. The spirits had been appeased, but at a terrible cost. The storm intensified as the shadows closed in. Alexander and Claire fought to keep them at bay, but it was futile. The spirits were too strong, their hunger insatiable. "Alex," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't think we're getting out of this." "Don't say that," Alexander replied, gripping her hand tightly. "We'll figure something out." But deep down, he knew she was right. The shadows surged forward, and Claire screamed as they enveloped her, her body convulsed, her eyes wide with terror, before she collapsed lifelessly to the floor. Alexander's cry of anguish echoed through the chapel, but the spirit spared him, retreating into the darkness. When the storm cleared, Alexander was found by a search party, huddled in a corner of the chapel. He refused to speak, his eyes hollow, his mind fractured by grief and guilt. The school was abandoned soon after, its halls left to decay. Years later, Alexander returned to the ruins, unable to stay away. He wandered the empty halls, calling out for Claire and Lily, his voice a haunting echo that no one ever answered. He became a part of the legend, a broken figure tied to the cursed school, his sorrow etched into its walls. The haunting legacy, a warning for the future. The school was left to rot, its gates locked and its name erased from official records. But the locals knew better. They whispered stories of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls, of the students who had vanished, and the shadows that still lingered. Those who dared to explore the ruins often reported strange phenomena, cold spots that seemed to follow them, whispers that came from nowhere, and fleeting glimpses of figures in the corners of their vision. Some claimed to see a young man with hollow eyes standing in the chapel, his gaze filled with sorrow and anger. One group of urban explorers entered the school on a dare. They documented their findings on video, laughing at the eerie atmosphere. But their laughter turned to screams when one of them disappeared, his flashlight found flickering in the chapel, his voice captured on the recording. "They're here. Oh God, they're here." The footage was recovered, but the missing explorer was never found. Locals took it as another warning, a reminder that the spirits of the school were not at rest. The land itself seemed to carry the weight of the pact, the air thick with unspoken threats. Those who pass near the school feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. The trees around the ruins seem twisted, their branches resembling clawed hands reaching for the sky. Animals refuse to go near the site. Birds grow silent, and even the wind seems to hesitate before crossing the threshold. Travelers who camp nearby report strange dreams, visions of a storm, of shadows clawing at their tents, of a young man whispering, "Leave before it's too late." A forgotten journal, found buried beneath the rubble of the chapel, contains cryptic entries. The pact must hold. Blood is the price. The spirits are patient, but they do not forgive. The school and its cursed grounds remain a dark stain on the landscape, a place where the past refuses to die and the spirits hunger for those foolish enough to intrude.